I'm going to show you how to create a lab environment in Google using their compute engine. We could easily use Azure or Amazon or even second-tier providers like Rackspace, or we could build our own VMs on our own environment, but I'm using Google instead of the other two major ones just because it's a little cheaper and a little bit easier, but you certainly could use the other ones if you wanted to. Our only goal here is to set up virtual machines that we can use to learn about the operating system and networking and things like that. So once you land in Google Cloud, if you go to the little hamburger in the upper left, you create your account. So your account should already be created. You're logged in. I don't have a video to create the account because I can only do that once, and I can't really create a video for that, but it's pretty straightforward. You just go to console.cloud.google.com, and then it'll prompt you to create your new account using your Google account. You'll put a credit card number in. It'll give you some free credits. If you're brand new to Google Cloud, never used any of your credits, you're probably not going to use them up in this, for these lab environments. And I'll show you why. But again, once you get this set up, you're just going to click on the hamburger. You go to Compute Engine, go to VM Instances. So Compute Engine, VM Instances. If you haven't used the VM Instances tab yet, you might have to enable it, but you don't have to go anywhere to do it. It'll just have a button instead of the page you're seeing on my screen right now. It'll have a blank page that just says, would you like to enable this feature in your cloud account? And you hit the enable button, and then it takes you right to this page once it's enabled. So once the cloud engine is enabled and you're able to get here, now we can start creating our virtual machines. So you're going to click on Create Instance up here at the top. You're going to give it a name. It doesn't really matter what you call your machine. There's some rules about the names. I think they have to be all lowercase. You can have dashes but not underscores. There's, if you type something wrong in here, it'll pop up an error message. For example, if I put a 1 on the front here, it'll tell me that it's incorrect, right? So, but you do have to follow the rules. For the region, I usually just leave the set to whatever they defaulted to as long as it's in the United States. I obviously don't want it in a different country for a variety of reasons. One, for regulatory reasons. I don't have to comply with somebody else's laws. But also it's just going to be faster if it's in your own region. Once I create a machine in a region, if I'm creating other related machines that are going to be in the same lab environment or that have to communicate with each other, I'll typically make them in the same region. That way they're in the same data center. I don't have to worry about networking, but you don't have to do that. It'll still work, but it just simplifies things a little bit if they're all in the same region in the same zone. So again, you can just leave the zone to any. I don't really care. It doesn't matter. At least I don't care, but you can set it if you really wanted to. But I usually just set it to any and let it drop it in any zone. And then when I come down here, this is the how much power I want, how much resources I want to use for this VM. One of the problems with virtualization with the cloud is it's a lot like your electric bill at home. You can turn your air conditioner on. As long as you leave all your windows closed, you're probably going to have a pretty reasonable electric bill. But if you turn your air conditioner on and open all the windows in your house on a hot day, you're going to get that electric bill. It's going to be pretty high. And the electric company's not going to, as a courtesy, give you a call and say, hey, just so you know, you're using a lot of electricity, right? They're just going to let you burn as much electricity as you can pull, 200 amps, 150, whatever it is. Same with the cloud. If I went in here and I accidentally selected a C4 and built my machine as a C4 machine, it's going to cost a lot more money than if I selected E2. And the sky's the limit really here. I mean, you could select a C4 machine, and I'll show you an example of here. If I select C4, I could come down here and I could do 720 gigs of memory. And if you look over here, my monthly estimate is $6,928. And if I have my credit card number in here, I certainly don't want to get hit for a $6,000 or a $7,000 bill, right? So you do have to be careful to make sure you select the right stuff here. So I'm going to switch back to E2 just to make sure I don't get charged for anything crazy. By default, this is going to give me a VM that's 4 gigs of memory and 1 to 2 virtual CPUs. But I'm going to change it here. I'm going to go with a small because I don't really need that much. For these labs, we don't need a lot of horsepower for most of these labs. We're not running these machines 24/7, handling real traffic. So you can lower this to something much smaller. So now I'm down to 1263. Take it one step further. You go over here on the left side. I go over to OS and storage. we could change the OS. So if you go in here, you're going to have to see some different options for the operating system. So if you're taking a course that needs a Windows VM, you can certainly go in here and select a Windows server. If you're running SQL on Windows Server, they have images that already have Microsoft SQL Server installed. They have Red Hat, etc., CentOS. So for example, if I select CentOS, I can choose which version of CentOS I want. What I found is Debian seems to work the best in Google. So I'm going to select Debian. And then down here, I'm going to do Linux. I'm going to do version 12, Bookworm. The reason I'm using version 12 is because it's got a little bit more runway. I'm creating this video and hoping to get 3 years out of the video. Previously, in a lot of my courses, I used CentOS, and I was on version 7. And you'll notice if I go in here, I don't even have the option to select version 7 anymore. They've completely removed it from Google. So my old labs don't work anymore. I can usually only get 3 to 4, maybe 4 years out of my lab videos because these operating systems, they come out with new releases. So I have to redo them every couple of years, which is what you're seeing here is the latest time I had to do this. So I'm going to choose 12. You might see something newer than 12, right? Hopefully 12 is there and this video isn't so old that it's completely missing. But I'm going to try to make my labs all using 12 Bookworm just because it's the latest one I have and I know it's going to work and I know it works pretty well. For the boot disk, I'm just going to use a standard persistent disk because it's the cheapest. I only need 10 gigs. You can't go lower than that. If I could, I would, but I can't. It's the minimum. Well, that's really all you need is 10 gigs. So I'm going to select that. Under networking, sometimes I'll go in here and turn on HTTP if I know I'm going to need it for a lab that's going to be using a web server, for example. You can leave this turned off and do it manually. You can set up access to the machines manually if you wanted to. But just want you to be aware that that's there. Pretty much everything else here, not really too worried about it. In some of my labs, I get into some of these other options because you might need it for something. But basically, you just hit create, and that's it. It's going to create that virtual machine using the settings that you configured. So gone are the days where we used to have to get a CD or an ISO or a USB with an ISO and build a VM from scratch, or even the older days when we used to have actual machines in our classrooms, and we would download the ISOs and use a CD to install, right? So don't really have to worry about that stuff anymore. We just click a button and it creates the VM, and it usually creates it pretty quick, as you can see here. So as quick as I gave that little spiel, it already spun it up and it's ready to go. So once I see the VM sitting in here, you'll notice it has both an internal IP and it has an external IP. So I can connect to this machine with the external IP. I'm going to show you how to do that, but in order to do that, we first have to do some stuff to get this ready. So we have to connect to that virtual machine using SSH. Google has a built-in SSH client in here that we can use to connect to it. So I'm just going to click on that little SSH button. It's going to open a new window. This is going to open a window to the console, to the command line. Not the console, sorry, but the command line. And it's going to connect to it using my Google account. So it's going to pop up a little window. You have to authenticate with Google, and then you're in. And you'll notice that it's using my Google user account, right? So I'm connected to this virtual machine that it built using my Google user account. The image that Google creates is integrated with Google's authentication, so you can log into your machines with Google authentication. But for our labs, we're going to set that aside. We want to use good old-fashioned password authentication in Linux using PAM. You'll learn more about that in my course if you haven't already, in one of my other courses. So the first thing we have to do is make a few changes here. First, you can use the sudo command to run commands as root. So I'm going to change the root password. I have no idea what the root password is by default, so I'm going to use the sudo command to change that password. So I'm going to use the password command, PASSWD, and I'm going to tell it I want to change the root password. So this is going to change the root password for my VM. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. All right, and I made sure I use something that's pretty complicated because these machines are public on the internet. They're not protected in our lab inside the school. Anybody who has that IP address or starts sweeping IP addresses with Nmap, if you've learned about that in other classes or used it in many of my classes or will learn about it in my classes, they're pretty easy to find open machines and start trying to attack it. So I always recommend using a strong password. It's really important for things that are directly connected to the internet. All right, so once we change the root password, now I can use the su command and I can log in with that password. So what this will do is it lets me basically run all my commands as root. You could also just use the sudo command to do this as well, right? You could just use the sudo command to run everything as root. So I need to create a new user account. This is the account that I'm going to use for login using SSH when I'm not using Google, right? So I have to create just a traditional user account in Linux. So to do that, we're going to do the add user command. Now I don't know if the add user, yeah, so it comes up and says the command isn't found. So usually you have to find it. So it's going to be, I believe it's going to be under USR sbin add user. Yeah, so you'll have to use /usr/sbin/add user and then the name of the user that you want to create. So my user I'm going to create is just student. I'm going to add my password. Fill out this little form. That's it. So I've created that account. I know I created that account because if I use the ls command to look at the home directory, I can now see a student account there. So it created that home directory. We'll learn more about this later on if you're in my OS class. So the next step, now that I have a user created that I know I'll be able to log in with just traditional Linux login, next I have to enable SSH to work so I can use login and can use SSH without having to use Google's tool. So to do that, we have to use vi and edit a config file. So you're going to find the config file under etc and then sshd _ I believe it should be config. So I'm using vi to edit this file. If you're more familiar with another text editor, you're welcome to use it. I use vi only because I'm familiar with it and I always know vi is going to be on pretty much every system I touch. Because vi is almost always, unless you have like a Raspberry Pi or something like that, and you have to install it. But or if you're using, sometimes if you're using containers, you might have to install. But VI is such a small package. It's really easy to install. It works on just about everything, so that's why I generally use VI and why in most of my classes I tell my students to learn VI. So I'm going to go ahead and open that file with VI. So in this text file, there should be only just a few options we have to change. So we're going to scroll this down. So where it says password authentication, right now it's set to no, which means the only way you can log into this machine is by creating a key for SSH, right? You have to create keys, which we could talk about. Some of my classes I talk about how to do that, but some classes I don't, depends. But in any event, if you change this to yes, it will allow password authentication. And that should be the only thing we need to change for this to work. So we're going to use WQ to save that change. By the way, if you're not familiar with VI, the way I did that is I used, once the file opened, I clicked I for insert mode, and that lets me edit the file. So I went and found that field, and I just used the backspace to get rid of no and then typed yes. There's other commands in VI that probably are faster and easier, but I'm just trying to keep this simple. And then when I'm done, I hit escape to get out of edit mode. And then I use the colon to get to the command mode, which brought that little command line down at the bottom with that colon that you see at the bottom. W is the shortcut for write. So W means write the file. Q means to quit after you write the file. And the exclamation means don't ask me if I really want to quit. So you could have just done WQ without the exclamation and it'll say, do you really want to quit? I just don't want to have to say yes. But when I hit enter, that saves the file. So now I know that that file's up there. If you want to double check that it's saved, you could use the cat command. So I'll show you what that looks like. So if I output the contents of the file with the cat command, and I have to pipe this into the less command so I can scroll through it. So now it says permit authentication, yes, right? So I know that worked. I'm going to hit Q to quit. But still, one more thing we got to do after you make that change to that file, it's not dynamic, right? You have to reload SSH. You have to restart SSH. To do that, you're going to use the systemctl command. So systemctl is the command to restart services in Linux. and then we're going to use restart, and the name of the service is SSHD. So that restarts the service. All right, so now my server should be set up in a way that I can connect to it without having to use Google at all, right? So I'm going to close this window. Here's my VM. It's running. It's got a public IP address, which you can see here. I'm going to copy that IP address to my clipboard. So I just use the little copy thing to put it on my clipboard. Because I'm running Windows, I'm going to use PowerShell. If you're on a Mac, you can open the console on a Mac and do the same thing. The same command should work. So on a Windows machine or a Mac, bring up the command line. On Windows, you can't use the command line. It has to be the PowerShell. So the SSH command, which is what we're going to use to connect to our machine, only works from PowerShell. Doesn't generally work from command line. You can make it work in command line, and I could show you how to do that if you really want to, but PowerShell, it just works natively, at least if you're on Windows 10 or later. If you're on a version of Windows that doesn't have SSH, you'd have to install it. I'll show you that in just a second. But the command to connect to your machine is going to be SSH, and it's going to be the username that you created. So in my case, my username was student. Then I'm going to put the IP address. So student at and whatever the IP address. In your case, student is whatever username you chose for your machine. It didn't have to be student. You could have used something else. I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to ask if I really want to continue connecting, because it's making sure I'm okay with connecting, because it's a new thing. It's a new key, right? This is a new encryption key, and it's making sure that I know that this is a machine that I trust. I'm going to say yes, I trust it. I'm going to connect to it, put my password in, and if I put the correct password in, I'm now connected to my virtual machine without using Google. So you don't even have to log into Google. You could completely close out Google, not have the browser open, go to a completely different computer. Sometimes I'll have students that do that. They'll use one computer to manage their Google environment, but they're actually logging in from a different computer altogether. You can even log in on your phone. I have an SSH client on my phone sometimes I use to connect to a VM, and I can run commands. So if you wanted to do it from a mobile device, you could. So lots of options. But I like using this for a variety of reasons. There's more tools available in the PowerShell to do things with SSH. I can copy and paste a little bit easier than I can using Google's built-in tool in the browser. Google's built-in tool sometimes can be a little bit kludgy, right? It's just, to me, it's better to use PowerShell. And it's probably how you would do this in the real world anyway. And again, if you're using a Mac, same thing. We also need SSH to work. If you want to copy files back and forth to or from your virtual machine, you're going to need to use SSH to do that. So it's a good idea to have it working. That certainly makes some of the labs easier in many of my classes. All right, so from here, if I wanted to run a command as root, because I'm logged in as student, I have to use su to get to root. And in theory, if you wanted to make this user a sudoer, so your student user or whatever you named it could run commands as a as root, you could do that as well. So the command to do that, and again, I don't know if it's going to let me do it without, yeah, so we have to prefix it. So it's going to be usr sbin and then usermod -ag. This is going to modify the group membership. So you're going to put a user into sudo, and the user I want to put in sudo is student. So you're just going to replace student in this command with your username. Oh, whoops. Put a space in here by mistake. Sorry about that. So the command is without spaces there, right? Because it's a path to the command. But that should work. So now if I exit, I'm going to go ahead and log back in. Now I can use the sudo command to run things like passwd root. There we go, so it worked, right? So now I have sudo permissions and I don't have to use the su command. I can run things with that sudo prefix. So I recommend that you do that. You'll have to use su to get in there, or you could have done it when you were in Google. It'll work either way. So you can do that before you use SSH. The only other thing I wanted to show you here while we're still sitting in here is if you don't want to use Google's tool and you don't have PowerShell that supports SSH, or if you just don't want to use PowerShell for some reason, there is a free tool for using SSH. It's called Putty, P-U-T-T-Y. You can just do a Google search for Putty. You should see a page that looks like this. I'm pretty confident it's going to look the same because this page probably hasn't changed in like 20 years, if you can't tell. I usually just use the executable. You don't have to install it. You can just run the executable. You can install it if you want to. It doesn't really matter. But I just download that Putty file and I can open it up. And here you would put the host name or the IP. So I'll just paste in the IP address, select SSH. I'm going to save this as my intro Linux VM. There we go. So now I've got a saved profile here. And when I click on that, you're going to see this little screen pop up, just like it did when we tried to SSH with PowerShell. It says, are you sure you want to trust this key? And I'm going to say I accept it. And then it's going to ask you how you want to log in. So in my case, I'm going to say student. And I'm in, right? Same thing. So this works the same way. So you can use Putty. Putty has a little built-in SSH client as well, just like, or a little file copy client that you can use. It has a nice little tunneling tool, which we could play with in some of our classes. But basically, this is how you can manage the system. You can use PowerShell to log in. You can use Putty to log in. You can use the console in Mac to use their SSH command to log into your machine. You could also just do it with Google if you really want to, but I find some of these other tools a little bit better, a little easier for copying and pasting, and it's good to have SSH working anyway because you might want to use a text editor on your own computer and copy files back and forth. That's certainly a lot easier than using VI for many students. But if you have any questions, let me know. But usually for my first lab, I'm usually going to ask you to just show me that you are able to create your virtual machine and you can log into it and you're ready to start going with the rest of the course for creating your VMs. So in this example, I used Debian. In some of my instructions, in some courses, I ask you to use a different distro, or I might tell you to build a Windows VM. It's really not all that different if you're building a Windows VM. The only difference is with Windows, you generally don't SSH to it. Instead, you're going to use Windows a remote desktop connection, which is a little bit easier, right? It's a GUI-based interface. So I don't really need to show that to most students, but that's the other option. So if you have any questions, again, let me know, and good luck with the rest of the term.